What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This episode number 558. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line all the way from Denver, Colorado, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, how are you?
I'm doing well. Busy as usual, but happy that we're getting to record a really sweet episode. I love. Not only do I love level episodes in general, this is one that's near and dear to my heart. It's actually the first episode that I recorded on LR, I think, not counting a guest spot I was on before I joined the podcast officially. So these are the episodes I think you will get the most out of as a player once you internalize it, but you will not listen to this episode and walk away a master at this. Of course, no one is. So I think that it's an important step on your way to kind of discovery, and it applies like the best episodes outside your life or your life outside Magic as well. That's
right. And this is of course one of our favorite types of shows, are level up shows. And this is where we go very deep on a strategic topic, and one that, as Luis said, usually will take some effort on your behalf to sort of internalize and make part of your play pattern and stuff. But if you do, you will see genuine results from this. Your win percentage will go up. And that is kind of the name of the game here on LR. So before we get into our main topic here, we've got a few things to mention. One, channelfireball.com. That's right. They're the sponsor of this show. And this Saturday is a CFB Pro Showdown. So there's a link I'll put in the show notes for that, where you can check that out. And this is, is this the third one, Luis? Or
this is the fourth one. And Huey is actually going to be the end boss for this one. So the way these things work is they're free to enter for CFB Pro members, and CFB Pro plans start at $5 a month. So they're, not too expensive. And you can win store credit if you place in top 8 of the tournament, but the winner of the tournament gets to play against the end boss, which is in this case Huey. If the winner beats Huey, everyone's prizes in the top 8 get doubled. And if not, they keep their original prizes. So far, no one's beaten with the end boss. It's been Reed and me twice. So we're going to see if Huey can maintain our win streak here.
That's a lot of pressure on Huey all of a sudden, isn't it? Yeah. And, so if you want to play in that and have a chance to get those prizes and stuff, it's available for CFB Pro members. Again, there's a link in the show notes for CFB Pro. And if you do sign up or get anything over at CFB, please use the affiliate code LR. That helps Channel Fireball know that we're the ones that sent you over there. Also, Baller Box. That's right. Baller Box signups close at the end of the month. The details are at channelfireball.com/baller. And CFB was nice enough to send me one, which I got yesterday. I actually have it sitting right here. And it's cool. You get a bunch of cool stuff in it. It's $50. They send them out quarterly, I believe. And they always send you more than $50 worth of stuff. It's kind of the way it works. But I've got some cool sleeves. I got a brawl deck. I got a package of booster packs. I got one of these like full art lightning bolts and stuff and there's other stuff in here that I haven't even looked at yet because I just got this thing. But yeah, these are cool. And if you like these sort of, these type of services where the things just show up, it's kind of like a present every few months and you're going to get some value out of it. You can check out channelfireball.com/baller to look at that. Also, I'm going to be giving away each of these things. I'm going to separate them out, but each of these things are going to go to, let's just say, a supporter of the show. Speaking of patreon.com/limited resources, completely unrelated to my prior statement, is where you can go to support the show directly. This is your direct route, to supporting limited resources, Luis and I. You've got a bunch of options there. It's fully flexible, meaning that you can quit anytime. Like there's no commitments or anything like that. You can up, down, change your pledge. You can you can put limits on it. It's completely up to you how much and how you want to support the show. We appreciate each and every person who does so. I mean, you can get in for as little as $1. And, that does give you access to cool stuff as well. We kind of set the Patreon up mainly, to allow for people that want to be a part of it in any way, shape, or form to get some of the coolest stuff right off the bat. Like you get to ask questions in our question of the week threads or our Q&A threads, or if we have a guest on, I'll put up questions there so you get to interact with us directly in that way. And then you can get cooler benefits as you kind of move your way up the chain as well. One thing that you also get, by the way, is you get access to the live stream of us recording the show, which is happening right now, in fact. And that allows you that if you happen to be around during the time, I put up a post right before we go live for the week, and you'll see that on Patreon, and you can hop on and watch us record the show live. And you even get to see all the fun mistakes, like today we started recording the show and the microphone died about 10 seconds in. So we had to redo it, but you get all the fun behind the scenes. So that's patreon.com/limited resources. I mentioned the Patreon question of the week. This one comes from, wow, that's a name. Dr. Ace Manliness. Wow. Hey folks. I can't remember if actually we asked this question before, but I liked it. Anyway. Hey folks. I've been having issues lately being scared to play into answers. I haven't found I've really enjoyed the faster pace of this format because I much prefer playing a reactive deck to a proactive one, and as I found myself constantly worrying about what potential answers my opponent could have. When it works out, like they don't have the answer or my aggro deck does what it's supposed to do, I feel like I got lucky. When it doesn't work out, I feel like it just reconfirms my biases. How do I learn to enjoy a deck that doesn't feel like my style and grow more comfortable in taking risks in Magic? And look at this, Dr. Ace goes wide and in life.
Well, I actually feel like Dr. Ace here is in pretty good shape because they're aware of their biases and are examining how they feel in both these situations. So honestly, I think they're in a lot better shape than they might think, because once you're at the point where you're actually aware of these things, you're going to do a pretty good job, I think, of taking away the right lessons.
Is it okay to have biases?
I mean, it'd be better not to in some ways, but everyone does. You know, there's conscious, unconscious bias. Like, there's conscious bias where you're like, I know that I like this thing more, so I'm going to try to lean into it. And then there's unconscious when you're maybe not even aware of it, but that's the sort of thing. Like if you really start associating, like, for example, you don't like certain kinds of restaurants like bistros or something, and someone suggests ones and you're like, ugh, that doesn't sound good. But they're like, you haven't even been there. And you're like, yeah, it just doesn't sound good. You might not even be aware that this isn't the kind of thing that you like. But in this particular case, how you get comfortable with taking risks, I guess, is one way. It'll depend on the person. Because for some people, it feels good to know, hey, I might have thought this was a risk, but now that I examine all the potential outcomes and the likelihood of each outcome, it's not as big of a risk as what I thought. I actually think that this is a good play, and now that I know it's a good play, it's a plus EV play, then I can feel good about making it. For other people, you have to look at the downside maybe and think like, hey, this downside isn't too bad. I think it's worth taking this risk because I'm okay with the worst case scenario coming out of it. And in general, the way you get over things like this often can be to just kind of try them. I think repetition is really important. You can untrain yourself from a lot of deep-seated things. If you let's say you had a bad experience with dogs growing up, right? A lot of people will have a lifelong fear of dogs, and that's fine. You can live your life being afraid of dogs. That's not like something that will necessarily impact your life too negatively. You just won't own a dog, and you won't maybe go visit a friend if they have a dog in their house. But let's say it's really important for you to get by this. Let's say, one of your good friends or potential romantic partner has a dog, or maybe even has like a guide dog or something, or some sort of service animal. You can take classes. You can, there are like programs you can use to kind of lessen your fear of dogs, or you can spend time with good dogs, and you eventually maybe start to realize, hey, not all dogs are the kind that'll bite me. And for that reason, I think that if there's a format in Magic that that you don't click with and you don't like, you have a couple options. You can kind of take that format off. There's always other things to play. Like if you like to draft, you can draft M21, or you can draft Amonkhet. Supreme Draft is out now. There's always older formats on Magic Online. You have your options. So you can maybe just have the format you don't like let's say it's M21, kind of take a back seat, or you can kind of go into it and try to just say to yourself, it's okay to play the aggro deck. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but it's good practice. And as long as you're okay with that, I think you will get better at it.
Okay. Yeah. I think it's interesting because you have to be willing to kind of own, like if it's not going to change for you, you got to be willing to kind of own it as long as it's not harming others, so for Dr. Ace, yeah, I mean, maybe you're just not an aggro player at heart, right? And, there's been plenty of successful professional players who don't really like to play those type of decks either. That being said, as Luis kind of kicked off, you're not optimizing. So if that's what you're really, really wanting to do, then you do have to kind of break down those barriers, and give it a shot. Thanks for the question, Dr. Ace. Okay. We're going to get right into the main topic here because we've got a lot to cover. And, this is, well, I mean, it's interesting because this is one of your first shows, as you said, Luis, and, this has become one of the big hallmarks that you've left on LR, and the kind of, each host has kind of contributed something to the legacy of our strategic approach to how we look at Magic and in many ways life and other things too. And, this has been one of your biggest one. And it's, of course, having a plan, right? Such a simple sentence, such a basic concept to grasp at the forefront, where you go, yeah, I should have a plan on what I'm trying to do here. I shouldn't be doing things randomly. But boy, does it go a lot deeper than that. And that's where we're going to go this week on the show. So let's get into level up, playing with a plan. First things first, Luis, what do we mean by having a plan? What is that? That's an easy thing to say, but what does that actually mean?
So before people get too kind of intimidated by, oh, does that mean you're supposed to plan out your next 5 turns or every turn of the game, or know exactly what every card's going to be used for, or you have one specific thing you're trying to accomplish? Mm-hmm. At its basic level, having a plan, really what I'm trying to kind of get across here, what we're really trying to communicate is when you take game actions or draft picks, those they should be with intentionality. You should be doing those for a reason. You should know why you're doing them. And ideally they build into an overarching plan, or, they facilitate what you're trying to do. But it's not that you need to have everything planned out to have a plan. It just means you should be aware of your goals, your tools, and how the action you're taking will help you take those tools and make it so your goals come to life. And, one thing, you can take everything I just said and apply it to life in general. It's really good to really be taking actions with, again, intentionality, with for a reason. Don't be doing things randomly. And again, just like in Magic, you don't have to plan out every single step, from the beginning. They can kind of organically lead to each other. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that every single thing I do in life or you should do in life, you should have a good intentional reason for, but the important things should. Yes. If you're going to take a new job, if you're going to decide which school you're going to go to, if you're going to decide who you're spending your time with, and those things, I think you should have a good idea of what you're trying to accomplish and what's important to you. In Magic, we do break it down to every decision because Magic games are much smaller than life. Right. Life is so big that it's too hard to have to I think really be super analytical about every part of life. I don't think that most people would find that pleasant. But if you want to kind of optimize how you play Magic, if you want to really level up, you should be thinking from before you play your first land until the last turn of the game. Make sure you're doing things for a reason. Yes. And ultimately in Magic, that's so you can win the game, right? You're trying to envision your route to victory, and the route to victory can be something as broad as I'm gonna beat down my opponent. I've got an aggressive deck, or I've got a controlling deck. I'll control the game. To as kind of specific as I'm going to cast Ugin, or I'm gonna mill them out with my mill cards, or I'm gonna get them down to 10 and then Zenith Flare them for 10. These are all examples of good plans. And what you really want to keep in mind when you're trying to build this plan is, again, how are you gonna? Because for draft, this is the awesome part. It's not what tools do I have at my disposal. It's first, what tools am I going to collect? What am I going to draft? Yes. Once you've drafted, then it's, okay, here's the tools I have at my disposal. How am I going to accomplish my plan? And your plan to win the game evolves over the course of the draft, but you should always have something in mind. And it sounds intimidating. I know it does. But if you watch someone play who's very good at the game, they can explain why they're doing all the things they're doing. And I'm not saying good players don't go on autopilot. Sometimes you'll watch a draft video or a stream and you'll see someone make a play and they'll be like, and the chat will be like, well, why did you do that instead of that? And they'll be like, and I'm guilty of this myself. Oh, I wasn't really thinking about it. Right. But, and it's not to say that every single game of Magic, you need to think about every single thing you do, But if you want to play your best games, you should. And trust me, when there's something on the line, we are thinking through everything we do, the people who are playing in these tournaments.
Yeah. And, that does speak to kind of the different levels that you see these plans thought of and implemented with, combining the plan that you put together while you're in the draft with implementing it while in the game is a really interesting dynamic that other games often don't have. And, you do see that happen over and over again within game as well, where you can do something like make a play that has a broad strokes implication on your plan, although it might not be, like you said, completely thought out to every detail of everything. That's not what having a plan necessarily means. It means understanding where the game's going and how things are likely to pan out if you take one route versus another.
And one of the things that we've done a show on and we often refer to are heuristics, which is kind of like rules of thumb. And having a plan and heuristics actually conflict, because often having a plan means that you're going against heuristics. You're going against maybe your intuition or the quote normal play. But that's why having a plan is so powerful. You get really rewarded. If you make good plans, you'll win more games than if you don't.
Yes.
And a good example of that is your opponent attacks you with a 3-2 and you have a 2-2. Just about every Magic theory says you should block, right? Yep. A 3-2 is better than a 2-2. Pretty simple. And, you're also preventing 3 damage. You're not going to be able to attack for more damage than that. But let's say that your plan is very specific, or your plan is maybe I really need to get them to 10 life because I have a 10-point burn spell in my deck, and it's really important. I will trade 3 damage for 2 damage because I'll win that race.
Yeah.
If nothing else changed, I'd take 15, they'd take 10, then I'd cast my 10-point burn spell.
Mm-hmm.
Or my hand has, staggering insight, +1/+1, lifelink, and draw a card when you hit them. Well, I really need this creature to live in order for me to put staggering insight and give it evasion and whatnot.
Yep.
So, and on the flip side, sometimes your opponent attacks with a 2-2 and you have the 3-2 and you want to block because I don't care about their life total, I only care about mine. And these are both cases where having a plan impacts your game, your plays to a degree where you don't make the normal play. You don't make the play that most of the time you would want to make. So it's tough, but you should get into the mindset of you should start having a plan basically as soon as you can in draft. I mean, the way draft works is you're not really going to know what you're doing generally for the first couple picks here.
Right.
Like you're kind of, heading one direction or another. But once you've got an archetype, or once you've got, maybe you first picked an Ugin. Ugin's a great example of it because Ugin does really simplify the game to, can I cast Ugin? If so, I win. If not, I probably lose,
Mm-hmm. That's right.
the way you want to build your Ugin decks.
Yeah.
And so if you first pick Ugin, it really drastically changes your pick orders. And you know what? Anyone who drafts has a plan, right?
Yes.
They might not know it, but there's a reason you can't just draft based on a tier list or a pick order.
That's right.
You can't just be like, here's the cards in the set ranked from 1 to 300. Take whatever the best one is in your colors.
Right.
The reason that doesn't work is because when you've got 2 copies of Spellgorge or Weird in Riddle form, wow, all of a sudden Opt and Crash Through become much better than other better commons in the vacuum. When you've got Ugin, you're going to be, killing someone for a Cultivate.
Yes.
Like Cultivate's going to be one of the best cards you can imagine, or a sweeper, or a good defensive body. Whereas when you don't have Ugin, yeah, clearly you'd much more often take, this aggressive card that's a bit higher power level over a Cultivate, like a Thrashing Brontodon, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So having a plan kind of starts in your draft, and it kind of shifts into having a plan during a game. And you should have a good idea in mind before the start of the game. And now, not every deck is going to have a very, very focused plan. We're going to mention examples of decks that do, of course. And I think a lot of the best decks in Limited do have these plans, right? Mm-hmm. When you think of the best decks in a format, it's decks that are making use of that format's themes and the right. synergy cards in the format, because those are the most powerful. Synergy cards have to be more powerful than non-synergy cards. Otherwise, they don't really make sense, because these are cards that are weaker in a vacuum, but when combined with the right card, give you an extra bang for your buck.
Right.
So you're going to have a plan from the beginning for a lot of decks. And in some decks, you don't necessarily have a firm plan. But this again starts from turn one when you play your land, and sometimes in limited, that's just not that hard. You're playing 9 plains, 8 islands, and you don't really have double colors, so it kind of doesn't matter what you lead with. But imagine a deck that has 3 double white cards, and your opening hand is plains, plains, island, but you don't have any of those cards in your hand.
Yeah, playing the island is a disaster. Yeah,
right. So it's really just we're really trying to impress upon you is to be thoughtful. To understand what you're trying to accomplish, and then how you use your cards to get there.
What are some examples of what a plan might look like? Not necessarily specific to a deck, but something along the lines of, the broadest strokes that you can have when you have it. Dovetailing off of the Ugin example. My plan would be draw and cast Ugin while still being alive, right? Like that's the basic version of that plan.
And Ugin's kind of a stand-in for what a control deck's trying to accomplish,
right?
Because we've both drafted plenty of control decks without an Ugin even style card, where you're like, well, my deck has 3 or 4 ways to gain card advantage. It has like 6 removal spells, a bunch of good defensive creatures, a bunch of good normal creatures. Because this is limited. You're not playing constructed. In constructed, of course, you know why this isn't. It's an important concept in constructed, but you're kind of forced into it in constructed. You actually don't have to rethink a lot of the difficult parts. This is why limited is harder, by the way.
Right, because it's more fluid.
Yeah, I firmly believe that's true. Because when you're playing constructed Esper versus mono red, both players know the plan going in. The mono red deck's going to try to kill the Esper deck. The Esper deck's going to try to control the game and win with like a planeswalker once they've killed all the mono red threats. That never really switches. It's rare that happens. And yes, sometimes you have 2 mid-range decks Bant against Sultai, and it can kind of go back and forth. But for the most part, constructed decks are extremely linear, highly synergistic. They have 1 or 2 plans, and the plans don't change a whole lot based on what they're playing against. In limited, you're going to have this control deck, right, where you've got removal, good defensive creatures, some high-end finishers, some card draw. But sometimes you're going to draw the game where you draw your good 3-drop, your good 4-drop, 2 removal spells, and you're like, hey, I'm kind of flooding out here, but I have a good offensive start. I need to kill them before they take over the game with X. Or you run up against the person who does have an Ugin and you don't.
That's right.
And you've got to alter your plan. But yes, in general, your control deck's plan is to kind of control the game and win with an expensive finisher or a hard to stop finisher, or maybe Teferi's tutelage or some other like sideways angle of attack. But in their normal plan and win condition is to deal with the opponent's threats.
Right. And in the simplest terms, right, it's make the game go long. Like the longer the game goes, the more my advantage will show itself, either through the expensive threats or through the card advantage that I can gain along the way. It's
actually funny. I said heuristics and have a plan conflict, and they kind of do, but there also are heuristics for plans.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Like your control decks, if you know you're drafting a control deck, you have you've ticked all the boxes. You're like, yeah, I'm pretty confident this is a control deck, right? You kind of know that your control deck heuristic, you're now in that mode, is not to trade damage. Let's say you've got a 2/2 and they have a 2/1 can't block. Well, you don't attack them because you'd rather block their 2/1. Theirs is slightly worse, but you don't want to trade 2 for 2. You've got a 6-mana 5/5 that has a good text in your deck somewhere.
That's right.
You don't want to just give. You'd rather both players be at 30 than both players be at 10.
Exactly. Yeah.
And likewise, your aggro deck, like let's say green-white aggro in M21, to get maybe a little more specific. Just as an example, everyone knows that deck is trying to attack the opponent. It's trying to put out cheap creatures. It's trying to use combat tricks to push past blockers, cards like Feat of Resistance to stop removal. And it's trying to kill the opponent before they can really leverage their expensive / better cards. It plays 1-mana 1/1s. It plays cheap auras and pump spells. And it doesn't expect to have great draws in the late game. You're drawing short swords in the late game, or cards like that. And the opponent's presumably drawing 4-mana creatures or 5-mana creatures. So your plan is to beat down. That said, that can always change. Sometimes you'll play a game. This most often happens when you're playing against another beatdown deck, and you realize, oh, I actually have a better late game plan. I need to get enough mana to pump my Anointed Chorister and pressure them with that, but I should trade off creatures and maybe not attack in order to facilitate that.
Yeah, it's funny when you see that gear change when you're playing against an opponent and you're like, oh, something just changed, and it's when they usually realize stuff like that. Yeah,
and we'll go over that a little bit later, but in general, you're going to have a broad strokes plan, and it'll range from like you said, kind of generic of I'm the control deck. I'm trying to control the game. My finishers are kind of interchangeable here. You know, I've got 2 Colossal Dreadmaws in my, like you're drafting a red-green monsters deck that has a bunch of removal, more high-end, isn't really the beatdown version, and it's going to win with Garruk's Uprising and Colossal Dreadmaw type cards. Mm-hmm. You're drafting an aggro deck. You're trying to kill them, maybe get them down to low life. And let's say you're in Theros, you have Wrap in Flames. You have 2 copies of Wrap in Flames. You know that you're going to be able to force through damage at some point, so you might make disadvantaged attacks in order to get them down to 6 life because you can pretty easily kill them from there. Sometimes you have very specific plans. I built a deck around this card. This most often happens with rares, sometimes with build around uncommons, sometimes with combination of commons. Red-black sack is like, I'm trying to slot in column A cards and column B cards. My column A cards are Act of Treason or Claim the Firstborn or whatever.
Yeah.
And my column B cards are Ways to Sacrifice.
Right.
And I'm trying to do that. And you know, you're planning towards that, but it's very card specific. Yeah. So plans can range here, but they all impact how you play.
Do you find that it's useful to have like a shortcut on if this happens, then my chance to win the game is very high? If I resolve Ugin, my chance to win the game is very high. If I can steal your creature with my Act of Treason and then sacrifice it, my win percentage goes up a lot, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so the best plans, well, I mean, hopefully you have effective plans. You don't want to have a bad plan, right?
Right.
Like some plans are bad. Someone drafts a deck and like they're like, hey, this is what I'm trying to do, and you're like, yeah, that's actually not very good.
Right. Even if that happens.
Yes. Right, yeah. Your plan isn't good. Your plan. I mean, I remember you'll see this with like build arounds that kind of fail. Like I remember Magic Origins was like you'd play. I don't even remember the name of the card anymore, though it was a constructed card, funnily enough. 2 in a red enchantment. You can tap 2 artifacts to ping something.
Oh, yeah. Something with Gearper. Yeah. Ether Grid?
Gearper Grid or Ether Grid or something. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you're like, well, my plan is to play this and get and draw my Whirler Rogue and play these other Thopters and start pinging. And it's like, that plan isn't good because if you get enough artifacts into play, this wasn't an artifact dense set, you're going to win with all your Thopters.
Yes.
And Whirler Rogue is a fantastic card.
Right.
So your plan here is not great. Also, if your plan is to draft bad artifacts to have the grid make them good, that doesn't work either. There are some cards that make bad cards good. Mm-hmm. This is not one of them, you know?
Right.
But you know, there's a reason that Ugin is such a good example because Ugin's just about the most blatant cast this and win card, right? And it costs 8 mana, so I think that's actually pretty fair. Like you're able, like I think it adds something to a limited environment to have it. When you hear complaints are when cards cost 5 mana and win the game or 6 mana and win the game, because that's just kind of dumb. Glorybringer is a kind of stupid card.
Right.
You know, 5 mana, 4/4. When it attacks, their biggest creature is flying in haste. Like you don't need a plan with Glorybringer. You just put Glorybringer in your deck that has 7 or more mountains, and you're going to win the game when you draw it. It's not particularly interesting.
Yeah.
Whereas,
which is part of the reason why people hate cards like that in limited.
Right. You know? No, I do think to some degree they should exist, but anyway, different topic. But something like Ugin or something like, hey, Teferi's Tutelage has proven to be a pretty effective kill condition, and you know, trying to assemble like 2 tutelages and a bunch of card draw is a fantastic plan. That plan wins a lot of the time. So the best plans are born of, hey, if I do this, I have a really high chance of winning. How can I optimize for this? And you're completely right. Most of the time, red-black sack is good in a format. It's when there's a common Act of Treason and good sack outlets. Because when you Act of Treason or threaten, you take their biggest creature, get to attack with it, then get to sack it for value. Yes, you win most of those games. That is balanced, of course, by the fact that all your cards individually can be kind of duds if you draw them at the wrong time. Mm-hmm. But when your plan works, you frequently win is a good place to be, and that shows that it's a plan worth building around.
Okay. You mentioned briefly about having plans at different stages of the game and in the draft and stuff. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Let's say that you draft a deck that has some type of a broad strokes plan behind it. That's a little more specific than, because I think the most generic version of not having a plan, right, would be like the prototypical mid-range deck in limited that just plays the best cards that you can get in your colors. There's not a lot on synergy. You know, maybe think of like an older core set or something where it's just like my creatures have power and toughness and maybe some abilities. I have some tricks. I have some card draw. I have some removal, whatever it is that complements them, and I'm just going to play them. In that scenario, your plan really does reveal itself when you start the game more than beforehand. But let's say that you have a deck that actually does have, something more of a plan going on, a build around or a slow deck or something. So you sit down to play your match, you shuffle up. If we did a checkpoint right here, you would have an idea for what you were hoping or intending to have happen in that match, right?
Definitely. And the more focused the deck, the more like specific and concrete the plan tends to be. Mm-hmm. So in the case of the cycling deck, it's like, well, I've got a Zenith Flare or 2 Zenith Flares, so I'm really lucky. I know that they'll reliably deal 8 to 12 damage, so I'm trying to get some early damage in. My goal is to basically cycle, play out some cycling payoffs, try to hit them, and then try to cycle into Zenith Flare. Okay. It's pretty simple, but that's what I'm doing coming in. Or, I'm playing a mill deck. I know that my goal is to survive and then use mill to kill them.
Okay, now I'm going to fast forward you just to the next step of the game, which is you're looking at your 7-card opener and you've kept it. Do another check-in here. How much is your plan likely to change, based on the fact that maybe you don't have one of your mill cards or, your Ugin's nowhere in sight or whatever? Are you now making adjustments already to your plan based on that new information?
Yeah. When I say have a plan, I, again, don't mean a document set in stone.
Right.
I don't mean something like you have to do it this way, because there's a lot of things that'll make you change your plan. Here's some good examples, actually. You're drafting an Ugin control deck, and you're like, if I play Ugin, I'll win the game. I've got some walls, I got some cultivates. It's great. You play against a blue-white deck, and you cast Ugin in game 1, and they're like, cancel, disdainful stroke, or whatever. And then all of a sudden, you're probably going to lose that game, first of all. Games where Ugin gets countered are not high win percentage games. Yeah. And then you're going to need to say, like, how do I beat the counterspell? This is bad. They saw me play Ugin game 1. If they have any more counterspells, they're coming in. Counterspell is the best card in the world against Ugin. In fact, you can't get better. So you're going to have to now say, like, well, is there a way that I can bring in some lower curve stuff to pressure them so they can tap out? Oh, can I beat them with removal and card draw, which is part of your deck too? It's not like you had all this removal that you weren't playing. It's more like, I thought I could play this game as such where the only thing that mattered was me putting Ugin on the stack. My opponent has shifted that paradigm. They're telling me it's no longer good enough to do that. How can I win otherwise? And usually your decks have other options. Sometimes you're kind of boned though. Mm-hmm. Decks with counters are good against control decks with expensive finishers. That's just historically been true. Right. Or you're an aggressive deck, and you're supposed to just play a bunch of cheap cards and overwhelm them, and you're gonna get damage through. And they have like a really good defensive play, something like a Thrashing Bronchon, a 3-mana 3/4, and it doesn't mean your overall plan of your deck has to change, but swarming them with 2/2s is all of a sudden looking a little less appealing. Because you're not used to them playing it that early, or they have some really resilient card. In some cases, there have been like indestructible blockers.
Yeah, like the 1/1 Goblin for 5.
Right. That guy.
Hate that card, but yeah.
So you have to think, okay, how can I go around that? Do I have cards that can make something unable to block, or is my new plan to wait till I have 7 creatures in play and just start sending in, waves where I lose 2 creatures and get a bunch of damage through? Or I'm going to side in a couple 5-mana 3/3 flyers, which normally wouldn't be good enough for my deck, but I really need something that can go over the top here or fly over.
So these are all good examples of you being willing to change your plan either on the fly or after a game when new information has been presented to you. So, that's something that I want to hammer home here early, right? Is that while you have an idea for the way that you want your deck to go, you should be open to adjusting the plan, meaning that you may still have the same end goal, but you're going to maneuver your way to that end goal in a different way than maybe was your most direct path, or abandoning that and actually switching tactics in a more cohesive, in a more comprehensive way. Again, I think a good contrast to this is a truly kind of vanilla mid-range deck where you are doing this on the fly throughout the course of the game. This is one of the great things about limited, right? Is that a lot of times the game plan changes for one player or another during the course of a game. And as Luis mentioned before, in constructed, this is very rare, especially in the older formats you get, the more distilled down these decks are, doing what they want to do and ignoring everything else. And if you can disrupt them, they kind of fold, and there's not a whole lot of gears to change. Well, limited has a lot of depth and a lot of gameplay where you suddenly find yourself in the position as the control player who's trying to beat down, or you find yourself in the position where you're the aggressive player and you have a couple of cards that showed up on your side of the battlefield that all of a sudden give you a long-term advantage, and you may want to change gears. Not only are we trying to highlight the idea of having, implementing, and understanding how to use the plan that you've got, but also the idea that it does need to change somewhat frequently. And with new information, it should be an adjustment for you each time you get new information to double check that your plan still makes sense. Because, Luis, one of the huge leaks that this concept addresses is if you watch, less experienced players play, they will almost always attach themselves to a plan based on the first 2 to 3 turns of the game. If they have a good curve out and the opponent stumbles a little bit, right? So now, they got him down to 14, they got him down to 10, but now the opponent plays something to help stabilize, and they go, okay, I'm going to use my removal spell. I got you down to 8 or down to 6. And then they play another thing that does stabilize the board that you don't have an answer for. They will just attack into it. They'll just be like, well, I'm the beatdown. I have my plan. I'm going with this. And you look at it and go, if you would have pumped the brakes here and recognized that you are no longer in a position to be the aggressor in this game, and that there is not a realistic way for you to, you don't have any red burn spells to finish me off if you start throwing away your creatures to get my life total in range or whatever, you could have won this game. Like, you just threw away too much board presence, to make that happen. This is where the implementation of things like have a plan can go awry, right? This is where a player decided that they had a plan. Good job. That is what you want to do, but they didn't bother to recheck if that plan made sense. And that's what I'm trying to kind of get here is you have a plan when you go in. Great. That's your plan. You look at your opening cards. Okay, does that change things a little bit? It might. Your opponent is playing a specific color pair. Well, that should change things for you a little bit about how you're going to approach the game, right? If they're red-white beating you down, it's a little different than if they're blue-green and trying to draw a bunch of cards and cast 6-drops or whatever, right? There's a much different way that you need to be adjusting these plans as you go. And these checkpoints are really important to help you understand that and help you, recognize, hey, I might need to make an adjustment here.
Yeah, and what you're saying is completely true. And it's kind of funny because it's like, okay, you have this plan, but, it's not really like a firm plan. You just have to keep switching it. Well, that's what the hard part of limited is, really.
That's right.
And here is another example, which I see all the time, and I can even fall prey to. It's really easy to. I'm sure you have as well, Marshall. You're playing and your opponent comes out the gates fast. You're on the other side of this, right? Where you're the one who stumbled, or they're the one who had a really good aggressive draw, and you stabilize and you're at like 7. And then you just pass up on attacking with like a 3/3 flyer. Because you're like, I'm the defensive player. I need to, preserve my life total. But then you really look at the game and you're like, well, if they had a removal spell last turn, they would have cast it. So they don't have one in hand now. If they do top deck one and kill my creature, they attack me, but they don't kill me. I really can't afford to attack with this 3/3 flyer. And in fact, if we took you out of the seat and sat a different person down and they looked at the board and they're like, oh, they have 2 2/2s. You have a 3/3 flyer and a 3/3, and you're at 7, and they, maybe have no cards in hand. Of course you attack with a 3/3 flyer.
Yes.
That's just a good attack.
Yes. But and if you make videos of yourself playing, by the way, you will also see it this way.
Yes. But you played the whole game getting attacked and you got hit by some removal, and that's why they got you down to 7. So you're like, oh, I'm the defensive player, but it's really not.
Yes.
Not how it is. And that's why you have to continuously be checking and making sure. And here's actually a kind of a good rule of thumb. If you're watching someone play, especially someone who is good, or someone like you're watching a Ben stream, or you're watching maybe gameplay from a Pro Tour, and someone makes a play that looks really weird to you, or you wouldn't have made that play, it's often because they've got a plan in mind. It's not because they're making decisions at random.
Right. And, and let's get into some of the nitty gritty on this, because one thing that I know I've heard you say before, and it really stood out to me as a lesson that, if you can absorb, it's really important, which is sticking with your plan can be scary, but you have to be willing to accept risk in order to increase your win percentage. This is where, this is another implementation issue, right? But boy, I can't tell you how many times I've even caught myself thinking, okay, well, here's like, I'm losing this game. Here's a potential route to victory. No, that isn't likely to work, so I won't do it. Right? Which, at a like fundamental baseline logic level, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. You wouldn't want to do something that's not likely to work. But that paradigm has to go out the window when it comes to implementing and having plans, because your goal is not to pick a line of play that gives you an above 50% win, chance to win the game. Your goal is to pick the one that gives you the highest possible, regardless of if that's 9% or 80%, right? It's like, you can't go, but that's probably not going to work, and then not do it and stick to some muddled in between thing that definitely won't work.
I mean, I have a good example of this from the top 8 of a Pro Tour, actually. It was when Raptor was playing against PV. And this is the top 8 of Pro Tour San Juan, which PV won, so spoiler. But and Paulo attacked Raptor with a 2-2 and a 4-4, and the 4-4 had a pump ability. It was Nirkana Shea. You could pump it up. And Raptor looked at the board state and decided to block the 2-2 with his 3-3 and take damage from the 4-1 or the 4-4. Paulo pumped it, and Raptor died.
What?
And the reason this was the best play, if Raptor chumps the shade, he cannot win the game.
He can never win.
He's just going to be locked into chumping at every turn. His best plan, his highest win percentage, which was very low, was to get the favorable block in, and hope, because he didn't block a potentially lethal creature that just on the board lethal, that Paulo wouldn't invest mana into pumping it out of fear of Raptor having a bounce spell or a removal spell, or well, not just missing it, because Paulo's not going to miss it.
Right.
And that's the kind of play you have to make. You have to make the play when they attack you with their 10-10 and you're at 11. You don't chump with your 5-5. You go to 1. Because guess what? You're not going to win if you chump with your 5-5. If you take it, go to 1, draw 6-6, now you can double block. You're in it. Now, there are, of course, depending on your deck composition, there might make sense to chump there and all that. But often, the plays you have to make are ones that make it look like you're almost assuredly going to lose. But because it doesn't matter, it's not the start of a game where you're on a nominal 50-50. We're deep into a game and you're at 5% to win. A plan emerges that gives you an 8% chance. Wow, you almost doubled your percent chance to win.
That's right. And and it's really important that that's the kind of lesson that you internalize, right? That you get rid of that viewpoint on, well, that's probably not going to work, so therefore I won't do it. That is not the bar. That has nothing to do with your decision when it comes to it about, if it is likely to or not work. It is, what is that compared to your other option? And that brings up a really important concept that goes hand in hand with this one, which is the difference between choosing to not lose the game for a few more turns versus choosing to try to take a shot at actually winning the game. Our goal when we sit down to play these matches is to win. So if that's the case, if that's the thing that assuming that you're listening to the show for that reason, that's why you're here, you'd like to try to improve because it's more fun and more enjoyable to see yourself improve and get better at something. If that's the case, and you make that assumption that, I am trying to win the game when I sit down, then that necessitates taking risks that allow you the chance to actually do so versus I can survive for 3 more turns and then lose the game. That is a very difficult thing to do, because if you are faced with a decision that says, okay, here's the situation. I have 1 card in my deck. It does 5 damage to my opponent. I can attack with every creature I have. My opponent's at 7. If they have nothing, they can eat my entire board except for this 1/2 2/2 that gets to get in for those 2 damage and knock my opponent to 5. Then I look at my life total. I'm at 18. This will leave my opponent with 17 power on the board. So they have to have nothing that can do any additional damage to me. And then I can survive. And then I get to draw 1 card of the 23 left off the top of my library. And there's only 1 in the whole deck that actually wins me the game. This is the type of scenario where it's so much easier to go, you know what? I'm just going to sit back. I'm not going to attack with my 3 or 4 creatures or whatever it is. I'm just going to wait and see what happens. I'm going to draw cards off the top of my library. Maybe my opponent will make a mistake, or maybe I'll get really lucky and we'll see what happens and I'll try to win. But if you were like in a playtest scenario and your playtest opponent was okay with it, you could say, you know what? Timeout. I'm just going to grab my library and just look through it. Right? Because I know sometimes you don't always remember every single card in your library or whatever. You could look at it, and there are many scenarios like this where you could literally stack your deck. You could just say, I'm going to put all of these cards in order on the top of my library, and you would still lose. This happens fairly frequently, that you get so far behind that it's irrelevant because you're still only drawing 1 card a turn or whatever, that you could not overcome what your opponent is, has in front of you. Being able to recognize that and understand that you need to take this absurdly risky play for a very small % chance, but it is the chance you have of actually winning versus effectively saying, I'm just going to give up on this game because no matter what I draw for the next 3 turns, I'm not going to overcome what my opponent has on the board. Or, they have 5 cards in hand. You know that they're all spells and they have an overwhelming board presence. You are not going to top deck out of that unless you have a sweeper or some type of other card in your deck. So, this inflection point comes up often enough and people fail at it the vast majority of the time. It's just so much safer and easier and warm and fuzzy feeling to say, I'll just hang in there, see what happens, that kind of thing. But, you should take the responsibility to know, no, I don't actually have a way out of this. So I need to make what looks like an absurdly reckless play, but that somehow is actually the best chance I had to win the game.
Yeah. And, it's tough to internalize, but again, this isn't, the whole goal here is to not be reactive, to be proactive. Mm-hmm. It's from step 1. You're drafting a deck with a plan. You've got a plan going in. You then, adjust the plan based on scenarios. Of course, there's some amount of reactiveness to it. Your opponent plays a new card, you're going to react to it. But in this case, there wasn't something specific to react to in these games. You have to make that opening. You have to figure out your path to victory. And you should always be thinking about this and recalculating this. And it can be hard. I'm not saying it's easy to continuously be updating your model and always be figuring out what the implications of that are. But once you get good at it, you'll do it kind of naturally. And the end goal is that when you make a play, whether that's attacking, blocking, casting a card, not casting a card, etc., it's with some sort of purpose in mind. And the purpose is going to help you build on your chances to win the game.
That's right. What about backup plans? What about the idea of, if this doesn't work, I have a viable other route that I could implement here?
So backup plans are kind of funny because on the one hand, it's good to have a backup plan, right? You're like, I'm going to play this 2/2 flyer, put staggering insight on it. And if they don't have an answer, I'm going to run away with the game with it. But if they do have an answer, I've got this backup flyer, or I have a card that lets me, I have a Return to Glory or whatever, Glory's Rise, to get back a creature and an aura. Mm-hmm. That's my backup. But you don't want to put too much weight on a backup, or to the point where it costs you your percentage of your original plan. Mm-hmm. An example of that would be, you have this 2/2 flyer and you're like, well, I'm going to put this aura on it, but I don't want to put the second aura on it because I want to save that in case they deal with it. But then they deal with it and the second aura is not enough, whereas putting the second aura on it would have maybe turn off their clock. It's the classic dilemma when you're playing against a sweeper, right? Do I add a third creature to the board and then lose it to their sweeper, versus holding it in hand to have play afterwards? Well, what if it kills them faster by playing it? Or what if I can't beat it no matter what, so there's no point in holding back? Or, hey, this is actually a good enough threat on its own. I won't add this 5/5 to the board, because if they have the sweeper and I play the 5/5, I could still easily win with it. It's always a balance. But the idea is that whether you play the creature or not, it's thinking about what they could have, thinking about how you're going to respond to it, and figuring out what's next, what'll happen then. Again, it's just what you need to be doing. And it's fine to have backup plans. It's good to think about what'll happen if your plan succeeds. The best plans are ones where if they don't work, you've got a second bite at the apple, because that means you've covered your bases. Oh, they counterspelled my 6-drop? That's cool. I've got a 7-drop too,
Right. Yeah. And those are really the best ones, because a lot of times implementing a secondary plan comes at the cost of the primary plan, and that's less desirable. Normally you kind of want to like do the thing you're trying to do well rather than like muddy the waters too much. But there is oftentimes when the overlap is there and it's really good. For example, let's say you're playing a reanimator type strategy where you're trying to get cards into your graveyard. So you're like, well, I'll put this looter effect, right? I get to draw and discard a card. Well, guess what? That's good anyway. Like that helps you discard big creatures to get back with the reanimation spell, but it also helps you hit your land drops or not draw too many lands. And so, these type of cards can have multiple uses and you don't really give up much. What about when it doesn't work, Luis? At some point you have to be willing to accept loss, right? That your plan failed, whether it was because your opponent had the right answers or drew the right cards, or because maybe it was not a great plan to start with or whatever. What do you do about accepting loss for this type of stuff?
Well, part of it is you have to kind of figure out this is something you should do really whenever you lose. Was my plan / what I did / what I was trying to accomplish a good one? Mm-hmm. Was it good? And because they answered it, well, maybe it was too easy to answer, or maybe you enacted your plan and you still lost. Those are always kind of brutal, right? You're like, yeah, I cast my thing, I assembled the combo I wanted and they still just beat me easily. Maybe that isn't actually good enough of a combo.
Right.
And then sometimes you just think like, yeah, you know what? Ramping up to Ugin is just a good strategy. It's an effective one. Sometimes you'll play against the blue deck that has 3 counter spells and you're going to have a tough time. You're not going to win those games. And that doesn't mean you should throw away the plan or reset. It just means you're going to have bad matchups. Because here's something else you have to accept when you play a game of Magic. There's always going to be things you can't control. There's always going to be bad matchups. You're going to lose, probably about half your games, a little less than half if you're really good. Mm-hmm. This isn't something like chess where you're a pretty heavy favorite when you're higher rated than the opponent. And plus, you can always just play against someone who's better than you. That just happens all the time too. So you just have to accept that, and that's kind of why some people have a problem with like loss of agency. They'd rather lose on their own terms than win. Yes. Because by just like the alpha strike across your fingers is something that a lot of people are really uncomfortable with. Your opponent's at 1, you have 3 3/3s, and they have 2 4/4s, and you're just like, my best chance to win is attack with all 3. Wow, they had the removal spell. Now I just lost all 3 of my creatures and just lost the game. Well, you know what? That's going to happen sometimes. So when you lose with a plan, you should be evaluating. What did your opponent do to cause you to lose? If they didn't do much, then maybe your plan wasn't good. If they had a specific answer or a really good deck or something that's in specific good against your deck, maybe their plan's fine and you just lost.
Yeah, and what I like to do is try to accept that loss ahead of time, meaning I understood that when I made this all-out alpha attack that there was a decent chance that it wouldn't work, but I've already decided that this is my best chance to win the game. And if my opponent has it, I don't fall off my chair and go, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. And I can't believe you had it. I, or at least previously shake their hand or, say, hey, you got it. Good game. And I can live with the outcome if I've thought it through, right? If I do something, like you said, like autopilot or reckless, or I'm just messing around or not paying enough attention, and then I just get blown out, then I feel like, oh my God, like I could have done something about this. But if I come to the conclusion that this is the best way to win the game, I think about the fact that it might not work ahead of time. And I kind of envision it. Like my opponent could have a removal spell here. There's a pretty good chance that they do. In fact, they haven't played one in 3 turns and they've got 4 cards in hand. But I still feel that this is my best chance to win the game. I'm going to go for it. And I turn them sideways and they go, yeah, kill your thing. I go, you got it. GG. And it's not a surprise to me. I've thought about that scenario and understood that a decent percentage of the time that's what was going to happen. So I think that's a good way to help it, is to kind of understand that there's a decent chance that your opponent has a thing that you don't want them to have ahead of time, rather than letting it hit you in this like emotional wave where you're like, I'm so nervous. I'm going to take this huge risk. God, I hope this works. And then they have it. You go, oh my God, they actually had it. And it's like, that's just a lot to process in the middle of a game. So, if you can kind of get a little bit of ahead of it and go, okay, if that happens, I accept that. That is a risk I accept. And then when it happens, you're like, hey, I went into this knowing that could happen, and I'm disappointed that it did, but I'm there. What about when playing around a spell becomes part of your plan? Because this is something that in limited is basically constant, right? The fact that you're always trying to figure out what your opponent has in their hand. How do you incorporate that into how you adjust your plan? Because again, we've kind of recognized that like while you have the broad strokes, when you get into the actual gameplay, it's very fluid, right? Things are moving and changing at a pretty quick pace. And you're changing around, at least on a lower level, how you're maneuvering through your plan. What about when you think your opponent might have something?
That really just should be part of your plan as soon as you start seeing what they've got. Mm-hmm. When you see islands, you should think counterspells. When you think when you see like swamps or mountains, you think like, oh, they might have more removal spells here, and you should try to factor this into your plan if you can. Let's say your plan is to load up a creature with some auras, right? Mm-hmm. Well, often those decks have something like Karametra's Blessing to give your creature hexproof or a counterspell. So part of your plan is don't play the Staggering Insight until I have Karametra's Blessing up. That way, even if they have a removal spell, I've got it beat. Or, you know what? I think my opponent's sandbagging a counter. Let me try to draw it out before I play my game ender. Mm-hmm. So what your opponent could have is very much part of the plan. And like we've mentioned before, sometimes you do have to ignore that. You have to understand if they have the counterspell, you're dead. If you tap out to load 3 auras on your creature and your opponent has, the final reward or whatever removal spell, you're dead. Mm-hmm. And you just have to accept that. But yes, you just have to, part of all of this is factoring in what your opponent's doing too. You can draw up your plan during the draft and deck building portion without knowing what your opponent has because you don't know who your opponents are yet. Mm-hmm. But once you start seeing what your opponent has or could have, that information should alter your plan as well.
That's right. And, I think that the emotional side of that is important. It's similar to what we just said, but it's the idea that you can acknowledge that if your opponent has a thing, you're going to lose the game and still proceed, right? That can be a big barrier for people. All right. What else we got here about our plan having activities?
I think so. We've kind of talked about how your roles change during the game, but what about during the draft portion?
Right.
You don't start by having a plan most drafts. Sometimes you do. Sometimes you take a Setessan Champion, right? The 3 mana 1/3 that whenever you play an enchantment, it gets a +1 counter and you draw a card. Mm-hmm. Well, your plan's pretty simple. you want to assemble a bunch of enchantments with your Setessan Champion, right? And look for other cards that reward having enchantments because you're planning on having that. But a lot of the times you end up just starting with a good black removal spell and then a decent black creature, and then you see a decent red removal spell. You don't have a plan yet. However, you do know that, say, red-black in this format, red-black sack is a pretty good deck. So you kind of keep your eye out. Oh, you got an Active Treason. You picked up a good sacrifice outlet. All of a sudden, all right, I'm kind of moving into red-black, and you'll start to prioritize cards for a red-black sack because that's a good deck if you get all the pieces. And then sometimes, you go through the draft and you've gotten like a ton of the support for this deck, and then you just have a very focused plan, and you're just looking for cards that help you. You're looking for weaker cards that combine well with these cards. And sometimes you go through the whole draft and you're just like, I'm a red-black deck that's got 6 or 7 removal spells in a pretty normal curve. I guess I'm just a red-black deck, and that's fine too. You don't have an overarching plan. You're going to kind of construct your plan based on what you see out of your opponent. So It can definitely vary based on what you have, but what you can do to prepare yourself is know what decks are good in a format. Know what color pairs tend to do, because if you know that blue-green tends to be enchantment-based and have enchantment themes, it doesn't mean you always have to draft that, but it means that when you're in blue-green, you should take enchantments a little higher in case one of those good payoffs fall into your lap.
Yeah.
And just, again, be taking draft picks with intentionality. Sometimes you take a weak or 2-drop over a good 5-drop. We talk about this all the time because you need your curve to be good. Even decks without a really linear plan need a reasonable curve. Sometimes they just have to take the 2-mana 2/2 because their deck won't be able to curve out without that.
That's right. And, I do think that you mentioned it earlier, but it's worth repointing here is the idea that you're, if you're trying to do some type of pick order thing, which we don't advocate for on the show, outside of just sort of understanding the basics of a format, you can do that. But once you're in a draft, if you have some ordered cards and you think that you're going to be able to pick from that is not going to work for you. Sometimes the picks change subtly and sometimes they change drastically. In many ways, that's based on how all in your plan is, right? There are sometimes there's cards that you just really don't play, like they're D minuses on our grading scale, where you're just like, you really would rather not have them in your deck. They just go up. They just do because they fill the need that you need filled to make sure that your game plan can happen. So make sure, the thing that you unlock here, if you embrace these ideas, is the drafting with the plan and then playing with the plan and then combining them. Like that's where you get a big bump that you might not have seen before, because all of a sudden you're dealing with this cohesive narrative from the first few picks of your draft to the last play of your games that all are telling the same story. Everything's pointed in roughly the same direction, and things start to come together. It really does. You'll be like, wow, like I made adjustments during the draft for my plan. I played in a different way than I might normally play on autopilot. And all of a sudden the wins really do start coming.
So let's just take a look at a couple decks that I have plans from kind of recent formats. Okay. We already mentioned red, black, sack, and control decks kind of enough times, but something like blue-red spells from basically every set that has blue-red spells in it. Yep. M21 is one of them, but it shows up all the time. And your kind of plan is to, you're trying to play to maximize prowess and triggers from like Spellgorger Weird. You're trying to get payoff for having spells in your graveyard or having played enough spells after a thing. So this deck is often going to like use spells inefficiently in order to facilitate those plans. When it's drafting, the bar for cards that are not spells is really high, because once you add up all the like Spellgorger Weirds and prowess creatures and maybe like the one good big flyer you opened, almost every other card in your deck needs to be a spell, or every card gets weaker. Every time you cut a spell for a creature, your Spellgorger Weird cries a little bit. Mm-hmm. And you want to end up with like 14 or 15 spells in your deck optimally, Those are the decks that are really strong. So this deck is so super focused and really cares about critical mass. You'll see this also in like artifact-based decks that need 16 artifacts to function, or token-based decks that need 7 or 8 cards that make tokens. And so these decks have a very specific plan they're trying to enact. Another one is a blue-black Reanimator, like from M21, where you're kind of a vague control deck. Sometimes you cheat out one of those, creatures on turn 5, and that's awesome with a Rise Again. But sometimes you also just cast them on turn 7, and they're also fine. The more pieces you get for the Reanimator puzzle, the more you start to look like a combo deck. But this deck's kind of on a gradient. Whereas like the blue-red spells deck can be controlling or aggressive, but in both cases you need tons of spells. The blue-black deck can look very differently. Sometimes you have 3 Rise Agains, and you'll play all your Discord outlets and all your spined Megalodons and Gormans or whatever. Mm-hmm. But most of the time, it's going to be somewhere in between, where you have like 1 or 2. You're playing them for value. You're playing cards that are good on their own. You're not playing bad Discard outlets. And how deep you go on the Reanimator kind of informs how linear your plan is. And you're going to see this across every format. In general, the best decks are the ones where they have a specific plan. That's just going to be the case.
Those tend to be the peak power level decks for sure.
Yes.
If you can get them. Couple of notes here about application of these ideas. I always like to try to hit on this because I think it's such a under talked about topic of working on the skill of being good at applying ideas, not listening to only half of it, and then running out there and trying to apply it. As always, applying these complex strategic ideas, it's difficult. It just is. If you get too cute and you apply them incorrectly, you can actually lose win percentage by doing that. Like you could make yourself worse if you try to take ideas like this and apply them in a inconsistent way, for example, where you say, all right, I'm going to sit down for this game. I'm the control player. And then you just ignore everything for the rest of the match, never bothering to double check or to recheck yourself to see if your plan should have changed. Well, now all of a sudden you could have just beat down your opponent and beat them, and you give them, 5 extra turns to get back in the game. Now you've lost win percentage. So you do need to make sure that you're applying these things correctly. A good heuristic I use for the kind of having a plan lifestyle is to just check yourself throughout the course of a game. At the beginning, you should have a rough idea of what your plan is and what your deck is trying to do, like we talked about, but this should be very flexible at different points within the game. For the mid game to late game, for example, your plan should be more defined. And what I mean by that is like, what cards are you playing to as your outs? Like, what cards are still in your library that you may need to win you the game? And are you playing the game in order to give you the best chance to draw those? What gives you the best chance to win this game is a question that you should ask yourself often. And as another reminder, this is not the same as continuing to not lose this game. I'm talking about win the game here, not, prolong your loss. If you can check yourself mentally and, realize that there are many points in the game where you might not have a plan and you're just casting spells and reacting to the things in front of you as they develop, you probably have a leak, and you can address it by using the topics that we talked about here. It's the same thing for formulating a plan, but then dismissing it because it might not work, or you've decided that it's unlikely to work or whatever, but you don't have any other course of action that gives you something better, but you've decided, well, I'm just not going to do it. You're going for maximum win percentage here at all times. You got to remember that number will often be far lower than 50%. Your bar is not, do I think this will work? Your bar is, does this give me the best chance to win the game? And if you can just keep those concepts in mind, you will see your win percentage go up. This is not about being 100% correct. We do not have a time traveling supercomputer that can actually tell us what the numbers were. This is a collaboration between Luis and I and you as our listener, but also among the Magic community, your friends, the people whose opinions you trust, where you can say, look, this bears itself out logically. Whether it worked out one way or the other in this specific instance isn't as important as I liked my plan. I liked what I was doing. It made sense. Nobody's been able to come up with something that said, yeah, I see where you're going, but overall that won't work because of these reasons. And if somebody does say that and it makes sense, then you adopt that and you change. But the idea here isn't perfection. I don't want you walking away going, okay, cool, I'd love to be able to implement this, but I don't know how. Like, I don't know how to answer the question on this gives me the highest win percentage. Nobody does. That's the good news. But you have to force yourself to go, okay, here's column A. I can do this. If I draw this card, and all these other things go right, I can win this game. What does column B look like? Challenge yourself. What does it really look like? What really is going to happen if you don't act in a more decisive fashion, like Luis has been saying? And if you get to that, and there's no evidence that you're going to win the game, and you look at the rest of your library and you go, yeah, there wasn't even a card I could have drawn here that would have made a difference at this point. Well, that's a data point for you, and you can move on, kind of growing that data set in your head as you go.
At the end of the day, I just want people to start thinking about why you're doing things. And this might slow you down at first. So maybe don't enact this in the most high pressure situations, but I want you to be able to answer the question, why did you select that card in draft, or why did you make that play, and not just, it was a good card, or, oh, I don't know, it seemed like the best card to play.
Yes. And if you can do that and feel confident about it, you're going to see that win percentage go up. Again, concentrate on combining the plan from your draft to your gameplay. Concentrate on that, because then you have this cohesive strategy that really pays dividends. The comparison that I can think of the most is when you look at a new player playing and they're just putting cards in their deck, but they're not really considering what those cards do, how they affect the overall power level of their deck. They just like them, or they look cool, or somebody said it was good, that kind of thing, versus a more experienced player who's more disciplined, who doesn't put, say, 4 or 5 card draw spells in their deck. Right? That's too much air in most decks, the vast majority of decks, where, you'll see newer players put 4 card draw spells and then an enchantment that doesn't really do anything, and a piece of equipment with 9 creatures in the deck. And there's just too much stuff that doesn't do enough. And when you get people on the plan, on the page of, look, let's put mostly cards that really do things to the board state with a few exceptions, a card draw spell here or there, a combat trick, something like that. But everything else is like very focused. You'll see their win percentage go up. And that's because their deck is now a cohesive unit that is all pointed in a direction of affecting the board, getting the win. This is like a more strategic version of that, where it's not necessarily the exact tools that you're putting in that person's hand, but it is the overall actions which all lead to more wins overall. Okay, Luis, let's call it a show there. Great stuff. I love topics like this. And Luis and I had a chat last week after the show, and we're going to be revisiting a lot of the core tenets of LR. If anything, we think that we should be saying them more. It's difficult as a content creator because we feel like we say them too much and we don't want to like overdo it. But I've also realized, and I think Luis has, and we've had chats about it, that like we don't do this enough to kind of get the core points that we want to get out into the world. It's not about making one episode where we cleanly, describe our points. It's about beating the drum. When you show up, these are also reminders to you, even if you're an advanced player, to check yourself when it comes to having a plan and the other stuff that we're going to be talking about. So you'll be seeing more of those over the next stretch from us as well, especially as we enter kind of the back half of a format where there's not as much going on, with like M21 or whatever. All right, let's call it a show. If you want to find us on social media, I'm Marshall_LR and Luis is LSV. You can find everything related to the podcast at lrcast.com. This show is brought to you by channelfireball.com. Make sure you check out channelfireball.com/showdown if you're a CFB Pro member and you'd like to participate in the showdown this Saturday. If you're not a pro member, you can go to channelfireball.com. There's a link in the show notes where you can sign up for pro. As Luis said, it's $5 a month, or if you get the $10 one, then you get $10 back in store credit. So you can get it for very reasonable price, and that gives you a bunch of bonuses. If you do get anything over at CFB, make sure you use the code LR in the affiliate code, and that way they know that we sent you over there. And last but not least, Baller Box signups close at the end of the month. Details at channelfireball.com/baller. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
So Wizards announced today that there's going to be no Hall of Fame this year, but next year they're opening up the hall to not just players, people who were instrumental in designing designers, creators, people who had influence over the Pro Tour and much more. And so we don't know what the full details of that's going to look like. In fact, this won't even matter for like a year, but I already know my ballot's kind of pre-filled out with Marshall on it.
Thank you.
I may be biased, but you were kind of at the forefront of the kind of second wave of commentators. The first time video commentary was a reliable thing. It used to be that only the top 8 was broadcast, and a lot of those recordings aren't even around. And I think I'm not taking this is the part I hate most about Hall of Fame season is the kind of the negativity. So I'm not saying anything about anyone but Marshall here. I think that you deserve to be in the Hall of Fame if the Hall of Fame does in fact open wider. And our listeners might get sick of it, but I'm going to make that case when the time comes around.
Well,
you can't stop me.
That's super nice of you to say, man. I
wholeheartedly believe it. You also have been a constant in coverage for almost a decade now. It's crazy. It's since like 2011 or something like that.
Yeah,
2012. I guess.
It went by really fast. Yeah, I will say that.
So,
I appreciate it, man. Thank you.
Yeah, well, yeah, you deserve it. So we'll see. Maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but that's the first thing I thought of when I heard that. And not to say that I won't be making the case for other people too, like for example BDM. But I gotta say, Marshall, you deserve to be there. So
thanks, man.
That is all I had to say.